Well, good morning, everyone. At the time when I'm recording this message, there are soon going to be two significant changes of leadership. We're going to have two new sets of leaders, and here they are. So hopefully by the time you're listening to this message, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will have been inaugurated as President and Vice President of the USA. And a little bit closer to home and a little bit in the future, but not very long now, Mark and Claire Ord will become the new ministers of Yardley Wood Baptist Church. And I wonder how you feel about the second of these. I hope that despite the present difficult circumstances that prevail everywhere, that you have a sense of excitement and hope as we welcome Mark and Claire into their new roles at Yardley Wood. And I was reminded last week by two things in our service last week. I don't know if you noticed this, but in the prayers, Trish prayed, "We have so much hope in our hearts this year. We thank you that our hope is in you." And after the prayers, we listened to Stuart Townend as he sang his version of the 23rd Psalm that says, "Though I walk the darkest path, I will not fear the evil one, for you are with me." Now, Trish's prayers and Psalm 23 remind us that we can look forward with anticipation to the year ahead. We can look forward with anticipation to Mark and Claire's ministry. We can be excited, not because we have a guarantee that the times ahead will be easy, but because we have a promise that God is with us. So as we look to the immediate future, we hope that vaccines will help the world to get on top of coronavirus. But our hope is not in the vaccines. Our hope, as Trish prayed, is in God. And if something goes wrong with the vaccines, our hope is still in God. And so this morning, I want to do nothing more than remind us of a prophetic message that was brought to us last January, by Neil Letizier, a message that he entitled "Stepping Out with God." And I would encourage you to listen to his full sermon, which is still available on the church's website. You simply go to resources, listen to sermons, and then find the sermon from the 12th of January 2020. And this morning, all I want to do is simply summarise Neil's key points. The message was based around the passage that we heard this morning from Joshua chapter 3, as the people were on the verge of crossing the Jordan and entering the promised land. And Neil gave us five lessons for us to reflect on. Now, you might argue we've had all year to do this because of the lockdowns, because of the pandemic. But I really believe that at this time, as we're about to welcome Mark and Claire into the ministry at Yardley Wood, this is a time to reflect on these five lessons that Neil brought to us last January. So the first point was that we should consecrate ourselves. Verse 5 of our reading said, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you." The people of Israel were looking forward to crossing the Jordan and going into the promised land. And that was an amazing thing. And I believe that God has amazing things in store for his church at Yardley Wood. But to receive those amazing things, to be part of those amazing things, we need to consecrate ourselves. What does consecrate ourselves mean? Well, it means to prepare ourselves before God, to set ourselves apart, to be different in how we live, to be serious about our life with God. So we consecrate ourselves. And then we remember that God goes first and we must follow. That story we heard read, it was important that the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, went ahead, went first, led the people across the river. Now, the people didn't know what they were getting into. They didn't know what the promised land was going to be like. They'd never been there before. For them, it was unknown, but it wasn't unknown to God. God doesn't send us into the unknown. He calls us into what may be unknown to us, but is not unknown to him. He calls us to be where he is, not to go somewhere that he isn't. So it may be unknown to us, but it is not unknown to God. And the third lesson was that to follow God requires a step of faith. The priests had to put their feet into the river. They had to carry the ark out into the river for the waters to be stopped. They had to take that step of faith. Now, just like the Israelites, we don't know what lies ahead. We don't know what lies ahead in terms of the pandemic. We don't know what lies ahead in terms of the life of our church. But we have a God who does know and who calls us to walk towards him, to take that step of faith towards him. And the fourth lesson that Neil brought to us was don't settle for second best. By the time that the incidents that we read about in Joshua 3 took place, 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel had already opted out of the promised land. We read about it in Numbers 32. They said, look, where we are now is great. It's fantastic for us. We want to stay here. We don't want to go into the promised land. They weren't willing to take that step of faith, that risk of stepping out in faith. And so they settled for second best. Now, God doesn't want us to settle for second best. God wants his best for us. But we can choose to settle for second best. We can choose not to make the steps of faith needed to have the best that God wants for us. So to counter that, the fifth lesson is that we're to build each other's faith. The people of Israel were told to take stones from the river and to tell others about what had happened, just as they themselves had heard the story of the people crossing the Red Sea as they escaped from Egypt. By hearing of God's faithfulness in the life of others, so our faith is built up. So there we are. Now is not an easy time for any of us. We've no guarantees that the pandemic will end anytime soon. We've no guarantees that when it does, other terrible things won't happen. But we have a God who we can trust, a God who provides for us, a God who walks with us in the darkest places, a God who in Mark and Claire has provided us with new ministers. Not new ministers who will come and put everything right, not new ministers who will come and sort out all our problems, but new ministers that will walk with us and work with us and help us to take those steps of faith towards God. Help us to consecrate ourselves, help us to put God first, help us to take those steps of faith so that we don't settle for second best. Amen.